In October 2023, a researcher was found at the bottom of a sealed well. Scratched messages along the stone matched his own handwriting. The well had no rope, no ladder, and no clear way in. He hadn't told anyone where he was going, just a vague message to a colleague 2 days earlier, something about old field notes, abandoned sites, a location that hadn't been registered properly on the excavation maps. He had followed those hints deep into the rural edge of New Zealand's North Island, into a valley where the grass grew taller than the fences and the trees leaned in close enough to hide everything beneath their shadow. The farmhouse was still standing, barely. Its roof sagged, the windows were gone, but the foundation held. Whoever had lived here had vanished long ago, maybe relocated, maybe not. But he wasn't here for the house. He was here for the map. In the basement, under a warped floorboard, he found it, rolled and sealed in plastic. An amateur's hand-drawn site sketch, crude but detailed. Lines traced along ridges, a square drawn at the northern edge near a tree, labeled with one word: well. It didn't take long to find it. 100 meters beyond the house, surrounded by dry brush, stood a ring of old stone just barely rising from the earth. No bucket, no rope, just a flat metal disc laid across the opening, like a lid. Rusted, heavy, but loose enough to move with both hands. He hesitated. There was no sign of any rescue operation ever being here. No marking tape, no survey flags, no disturbed earth. It felt untouched, undisturbed. He slid the cover aside and pointed his flashlight down into the dark. A narrow shaft, circular, made of rough stone. Moss and roots clung to the walls, but the structure itself was intact. He dropped a pebble in. No splash, just the faintest bounce. He should have turned back, but curiosity, academic, obsessive, pushed him forward. He anchored a short rope to a nearby root cluster, fastened his harness, and began to lower himself in. The walls were tight, but manageable. Moisture dripped from overhead. The air cooled quickly. He counted every meter. 10, 15, 20. Then the rope snapped. It didn't fray. It didn't stretch. It snapped. Clean, sudden. He fell. Not far, but far enough to slam hard against the floor of the shaft.
The impact knocked the breath out of him. For several minutes he lay still, heart racing, ears ringing. Then came the silence. The kind of silence that doesn't just lack sound, but eats it. Thick, pressing. He turned on his flashlight again. The beam revealed stone walls, scuffed and scored with age. He was in a lower chamber, an opening beneath the well shaft, almost like a crawl space, but shaped deliberately, too round to be natural. He stood slowly, testing his limbs. Nothing broken, just bruises. He looked up. The shaft was too high, too smooth, and the rope, his only way out, hung limp and broken 1 meter above his reach. He was trapped. For now. But what unsettled him most wasn't the height. It was what he saw scratched into the stone behind him. A name. His name. In his handwriting. And just beneath it, words carved deep and hurried. Do not follow the whisper. The daylight above was completely gone now, replaced by a dull gray absence that hovered far beyond reach. The circle of sky
once visible through the narrow shaft, had faded into darkness, and all that remained was a soft creaking of the broken rope swinging just out of reach. He jumped once, then again, trying to grasp the frayed end, but it was clear. Climbing back up was no longer an option. The stone around him was cold and damp, pressing in from every side, and the air held a strange, stale stillness, like something buried and forgotten long ago. He turned slowly, directing his flashlight toward the chamber wall, where the faint markings he had noticed earlier were still visible. It was his name. The letters had been scratched in a rough line, deep into the stone, written with a shaky but unmistakably familiar hand. He leaned in, scanning each curve and tilt of the writing, and with growing unease realized that the way the letter slanted, the way the R curved slightly left, it was identical to the way he wrote. Even the spacing between words was the same. But he had never been here before. Just below his name, carved with urgency and deeper cuts, were the words he couldn't ignore. Do not follow the whisper. There was no mistaking it. These weren't random carvings.
Someone or something had left him a message, and that message wasn't meant for anyone else. He stood still for a long moment, letting the silence press against his ears as he tried to calm the panic rising in his chest. When he finally turned away from the inscription, he noticed something he had missed before. A small opening toward the far side of the chamber, partially obscured by thick roots that clung to the stone like veins. It wasn't part of the well shaft. It was a narrow passage, perhaps no wider than his shoulders, leading downward into the earth. The air seeping from it was cold and sharp, without any of the earthy scent you'd expect from underground spaces. It smelled sterile, almost manufactured. He knew every instinct told him to wait, to stay near the light, to conserve battery and hope for rescue. But staying still didn't feel any safer. Something about the way the roots seemed to curl inward, the way the walls subtly pulsed with moisture, made him feel watched, even when nothing moved. With flashlight in hand, he crawled into the passage. The stone beneath him scratched against his jacket, and each movement echoed with dull friction. After several meters, the passage widened slightly, just enough for him to stand, and opened into a domed-shaped chamber. The walls of this new space were covered in markings, hundreds of them, spanning centuries of styles and languages. At first, he thought they were decorative, maybe ceremonial, but then he saw newer lines scratched between the older symbols. Phrases in English, carved in scattered, almost desperate patterns, filled the gaps between what looked like ancient glyphs. Don't look back. Left on day 3. No exit up. Stop when the echo repeats. The words hit harder than any carved rune. They were raw, direct, and personal. Whoever had left these messages had been down here long enough to lose track of time, but not enough to lose their mind entirely. He took one step back, heart pounding now for a different reason. Something inside him whispered that these weren't random warnings. They weren't meant to scare him. They were meant to guide him. Just then, from the tunnel behind, a voice reached him. Faint, distant, a single word. Hello? It was spoken softly, almost kindly, and for a brief moment he considered answering. But something about the tone felt off. He turned off the flashlight, and in the complete darkness, another sound emerged. Breathing. Very close.
and it wasn't his. He didn't turn around right away. Instead, he stood in the dark, completely still, holding his breath as if that might help him separate his own presence from whatever was now sharing the space with him. The breathing he heard wasn't panicked or heavy. It was slow, deliberate, and unsettlingly calm. Whoever or whatever it belonged to wasn't struggling. It was waiting. He remained frozen for nearly a minute before finally switching the flashlight back on. The beam shook slightly in his hand as it swept the chamber. The curved stone walls returned to view, along with the carvings, the markings, and the familiar silence. But nothing else. No person, no animal, not even a trace of movement where the sound had come from. And yet he knew what he'd heard. Trying to make sense of it felt impossible. If sound could carry that clearly, someone or something had to be within only a few feet of him. But the moment he illuminated the space, the breathing vanished. Either the air itself had played a trick on him, or something had simply withdrawn into the dark. He pressed on. The carved messages on the walls drew his attention again. Now that his eyes had adjusted, he could see how layered and inconsistent they were. Some phrases were etched lightly, faded with time and water exposure. Others had been carved with violence, as if someone had used the edge of metal to scratch messages in a panic. Then came the moment that changed everything. On a flat section of the wall, half covered in dried mud, he saw a series of markings that made him step back. They weren't symbols. They were drawings, crude sketches in blackened soot, each showing a different figure standing in front of the well. And below each one, a date. One was from 1996, another from 1972, but the last one, at the far end, had today's date. His hand trembled slightly as he wiped away the dirt to see the final detail. The figure in the sketch wore a jacket like his. Even the stitching on the sleeve was right. A tiny rip on the left shoulder. His hand dropped to the tear on his own jacket, as if needing confirmation. Whoever had drawn that image knew exactly what he'd be wearing. He staggered back a step, trying to think of any logical explanation. Maybe a coincidence. Maybe someone had been watching him through cameras. Maybe it was some elaborate setup, an experiment, or a trap. But the more he tried to rationalize, the more the walls around him seemed to tighten, as if rejecting logic altogether. He turned away from the sketch and began moving through the far passage, trying to distance himself from the carvings. The tunnel curved, then dipped. The air grew colder. His flashlight flickered once, then steadied. Every few steps he could feel the floor vibrating softly, like there was something shifting deep beneath the stone. He reached a narrow junction, 3 passageways branching in different directions. There were no signs, no carvings to guide him, just silence. He listened for any clue, any sound that might help him choose. Then, faintly, from the leftmost tunnel, he heard something familiar. It was his own voice. He couldn't make out the words, just the tone, the cadence. It was as if someone had recorded him speaking and was now playing it back through a thick wall. He froze, torn between curiosity and fear, knowing that whatever was mimicking him was too close for comfort. And yet, part of him needed to know what it was. He stepped toward the sound. The voice stopped, and the darkness ahead seemed to stretch even farther than before. The corridor ahead narrowed once again, pressing his shoulders inward with every step. The walls here were slick with condensation, as if the stone itself were sweating. His flashlight cut through the darkness, but barely. Its beams seemed to dissolve as soon as it hit the surface,
swallowed up by the depth of the tunnel. The sound of his own voice had disappeared. No echo, no trace, no reply, just stone and breath. He pressed forward slowly, careful not to rush. Every noise he made, footsteps, fabric brushing against the rock, the occasional exhale, returned to him in strange, fractured echoes. Not as they should have sounded, but slightly delayed and sometimes altered. It was as if the tunnel had developed a rhythm of its own, a way of manipulating even the simplest human sounds into something unfamiliar.
Then, from somewhere behind him, he heard movement. Not loud, just a shift, a scrape, a single footstep. He turned immediately, flashlight sweeping the tunnel, but saw only the empty path he'd just walked. Still, he stood there for a long time, not moving, waiting to hear it again. Nothing came. No confirmation. But the dread settled in deeper. He took a deep breath and continued forward until the tunnel opened once more into a small chamber. This one was different. Above him, far above, the original shaft was visible again, just a thin slit of light in the ceiling, like the eye of some ancient creature that had blinked open. He recognized the angle, the curvature of the stone walls. Somehow, impossibly, he had returned to the first chamber where he had landed after the rope snapped. But something was different now. The markings on the wall had changed. The messages were still there, still carved deeply, but the newest one was longer than before. It hadn't been there when he first read them. His flashlight caught the fresh edges of the scratches, the stone dust still gathered at the base. If you're reading this again, it means you didn't listen. His stomach turned. He backed away from the wall and turned toward the shaft. The rope, previously dangling out of reach, was now completely gone. No trace of it, no frayed end, just the smooth stone ceiling, unreachable and unhelpful. Then a voice echoed from above. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was his name, clear, neutral, spoken without emotion. He tilted his head back, hoping to spot a silhouette or movement near the edge, but nothing appeared, just the faint light and the voice calling again, same tone, same volume. "Are you still down there?" His throat dried instantly. He didn't reply, but the voice continued, as if reading from a script that didn't require interaction. "You stayed longer than the last one. That's progress." His heart pounded in his ears, drowning out the silence between phrases. "We can try again. You'll remember more this time." The voice stopped. No footsteps, no rope, no explanation. Just a quiet thud above, like something being set down on the edge of the opening. Then, slowly, a coil of rope lowered into view, thicker, stronger, freshly knotted.
He stared at it uncertain. It was exactly what he needed, and that's what frightened him. Rescue never looked that perfect. Still, the opportunity to leave was real. He tested the rope. It held. Slowly, hand over hand, he climbed, expecting at any moment for the fibers to snap again, or for the ceiling to close. But the rope stayed firm. As he pulled himself over the lip of the shaft, he reached a new chamber, this one unfamiliar. He wasn't back at the surface. He was deeper. The walls were the same stone, but carved across every surface, floor, ceiling, doorway, was a single repeated phrase. The well is not a place. It's a pattern. He stood in the center of the chamber, surrounded by the same sentence,
repeated over and over, carved in different styles, different depths, as if left by countless hands across countless years. The words stared back at him from every direction. The well is not a place, it's a pattern. He whispered them once under his breath, not to believe them, but to feel the shape of the phrase in his mouth. Somehow, hearing it aloud made it more real, less of a warning, more of a law. The air in the room had changed. It felt heavy, not like pressure from depth, but like being inside a machine that had just activated. He couldn't explain it, but the walls themselves felt closer, still stone, still unmoving, but attentive, as if they were no longer just part of the space, but participants in it. He moved slowly, testing each step on the uneven floor. The carvings beneath his boots shifted subtly, like sand reshaping after each step. Not enough to see, just enough to feel. In the center of the floor was a symbol, different from the others. A circle. Inside it, 4 smaller circles, interconnected by a web of thin lines. It looked like a map, or maybe a sequence. He knelt to study it, brushing away dust and debris. As his fingers traced the etchings, he felt warmth, not from the stone, but from within himself. Recognition, like touching a memory that hadn't yet happened. He reached for his notebook to sketch the design. It wasn't there. In its place was another notebook, older, worn, with a different cover.
He opened it carefully. Every page was filled with handwriting. His handwriting. Line after line of detailed notes, observations, entries he hadn't written, places he hadn't visited. But the descriptions were precise, including markings from the tunnel, details from the carvings, even the moment he heard the voice mimic his own. Each page ended the same way. You are not the first, but you might be the last. He closed the book. Somewhere deeper in the structure, a new sound emerged. A soft rumbling, rhythmic and deep, like machinery warming up far below. It wasn't threatening. It was steady, mechanical, almost like breathing scaled to stone and earth. He looked around the chamber and found a narrow passage leading away from the main ring. The walls of this tunnel were smoother than the others, as if intentionally polished. And unlike the jagged, chaotic pathways behind him, this one was straight, purposeful. As he walked, he noticed light, not from his flashlight. He had switched it off instinctively when he entered, but from the stone itself. Faint lines glowed along the walls, pulsing gently, guiding him forward with a kind of silent invitation. At the end of the passage was a chamber shaped like a dome. Inside stood 5 stone columns, arranged in a perfect circle. In the center of that circle, a single object, a mirror. But it didn't reflect the chamber. It reflected the well, from above, as if he were looking down into it, not up from inside it. He could see the ring of stone, the overgrown field, even the farmhouse beyond the trees. It was daylight, but no one was there. No rope, no equipment, no sign of his presence. And yet, his reflection remained, not as he was now, but standing at the edge of the well, looking down, wearing the same jacket, the same torn sleeve, but older, tired, a different version of himself. The mirror rippled slightly, as if inviting him to reach through. He raised a hand, half expecting it to pass into the glass, but stopped just short. His fingers hovered against the surface. Then the reflection moved. The man at the top of the well lifted his hand in return, but with the opposite arm. Not mirroring, mimicking.
And then he mouthed something he couldn't hear.
but he could read the words. Don't come back. The mirror went dark, and behind him, the tunnel sealed shut. He stared at the sealed tunnel for several minutes, unsure whether it had closed by design or by accident. The smooth stone where the entrance had been showed no cracks, no outline of a door, not even a hint that it had ever opened. It was as if the well had decided, without warning, that he no longer needed to go back. There was no panic, not yet. He turned toward the mirror again, hoping it would still respond, but the surface was now dull, lifeless, just polished black stone. Whatever mechanism had animated it, light, vision, whatever strange force had shown him that image, was gone, and with it, the idea that he might return the way he came. But there was still something different about this chamber. The 5 stone columns surrounding the mirror weren't just decorative. Each one bore an engraving near its base. Simple shapes, circles, squares, triangles, but also letters. Not English, not even Latin. Symbols he couldn't identify but felt inexplicably familiar. And between the columns, faint trails in the dust, like someone had walked this circle many times before, pacing between choices. He followed the footprints. Some were shallow, recently disturbed. Others, older, had softened into the floor. But one set led to a curved section of wall that didn't match the rest. The stone there was smoother, lighter in color, and cold. He placed his hand against it, and to his surprise, it pushed inward just slightly. A soft click echoed through the chamber. The wall opened. Beyond it was another passage, wider and lit from within by that same pulsing glow. The floor was dry, the air warmer, not the cold, stale draft he had grown used to, but something closer to wind, fresh air. He moved faster now. Each step echoed louder. The tunnel inclined steadily, taking him upward. His flashlight was no longer necessary. The walls themselves emitted a pale light, as though responding to his movement. He didn't question it. He just kept going. Eventually, the tunnel ended in a flat metal panel. It wasn't ancient. It was industrial. Steel, bolted, with a handle. The kind of thing you'd find in a secure facility. He hesitated only for a second before pulling it open. Bright light hit his eyes. Daylight. He shielded his face as he stepped out into open air. He was in a forest clearing, different from the one he'd entered days ago. The trees were taller here. The air felt cleaner. And the farmhouse, the one he had used as a reference point, was nowhere in sight. There was no sign of the field, no stone ring, no well, only a narrow dirt path leading into dense woods. He turned to look at the door behind him, expecting to see the entrance to some underground structure. But there was nothing, just rock and brush. The panel had vanished. Not hidden, gone. And then came the most unsettling realization of all. His watch. It was gone. His phone, dead and rusted. The zipper on his jacket, now corroded and brittle. Everything on him had aged. He ran a hand along his beard, longer than it should have been. He moved toward the path, unsure of the time, the date, even the year. Somewhere in his mind, the idea formed that time in the well hadn't passed the same way, that the circular chamber hadn't just shifted direction, it had bent time itself. But he was out. That was all that mattered. He followed the trail for hours. Eventually, he heard traffic, distant, faint, but real. Tires over gravel, the hum of engines, civilization. When he reached the edge of a paved road,
A small vehicle pulled over almost instantly. A woman rolled down her window. She asked if he was all right, said he looked like he'd been lost for days. He gave her a name, his name. She hesitated, then said he matched a missing persons report, filed 12 years ago. He tried to laugh it off, but in the reflection of her window, he saw himself, and the man looking back was older than he remembered, much older. She offered to call someone. He said yes, but even as he sat in the car, even as help arrived, even as he tried to explain where he had been, none of it felt anchored to anything real. Because late that night, in the hospital, when the nurse stepped away and the hallway fell quiet, he heard it again. From the air vent above his bed, his own voice, whispering the same words he had read carved into the stone. You are not the first.